everyone, and welcome back to the Manic Manor podcast. This is Mitchie. Today's episode, we are going to look into air flight disasters. Specifically, today's episode centers around Pacific Southwest Airline Flight 1771. This involves a perpetrator by the name of David Augustus Burke, who at the time was a 35-year-old man who had worked for USA Air for about 15 years and was subsequently fired on November 19, 1987, for stealing roughly around $70 from in-flight proceeds. And in his anger, he decided to unveil a mass suicide and murder of the entire flight. Now, he was sometimes described by former friends and neighbors as being a very violent man, never got married, but he did have a girlfriend at the time and did have 7 children from 4 different women. Now, David's early life revolved around growing up in the United Kingdom and was raised by Jamaican parents before eventually immigrating over to the United States. In his young adulthood, David's work was within the aviation industry within New York and California for doing simple ground services. Now, at the time of the incident, he was employed by PSA, the Pacific Southwest Airlines, and PSA ended up being purchased by US Air, which is why he was under them working at the time. Now, another key figure in this episode we'll mention is a man by the name of Raymond Thomas. He was the man who ended up actually firing David due to the theft. He was David's supervisor. Now, David's family had allegedly been struggling, and with him seeing no other choice, he decided to take the portion of these proceeds to make ends meet. Now, David did try to file an appeal regarding being terminated. However, this was unfruitful, to say the least. He was still terminated. However, even though he was fired, he still somehow managed to keep his air credentials. Now, working for the airlines since the 1970s, this was a devastating blow to Burke. Which brings us to the date of December 7th, 1987. Despite being fired, David still had in his possession airport credentials that allowed him to bypass regular checks of the airport. For some reason, at the time, employees were able to bypass this, but of course, passengers for these airlines still had to go through these checks. He purchased a one-way ticket to San Francisco on the exact flight as his ex-supervisor, who would use this plane to fly back home because he lived in San Francisco and would use the plane as a commute to come to LAX to work. It wasn't uncommon for airport officials and to sometimes use these planes as a means for travel to work. Ray Thompson did it all the time, and everybody who was employed under him knew exactly what flights he would be on, what he was doing. Now, this plane that he happened to board was a BAE plane known as Flight 1771, and David decided he was going to board this plane with nobody any the wiser that he had a Smith & Wesson revolver on his person and the grave intent that he had in his mind. The captain of the airplane had been with the air flight since 1973, and his name was Greg Lindemann, and first mate was James Nunn, who was only recently hired. So this was one of the very first flights that he had taken with this airline. Now, all in total on the plane, there was about 44 people on board, hoping to reach San Francisco within an hour. So it was supposed to be a fairly short flight. A regular one that had been done many, many times prior with no issues. Now, David disguised himself as just a regular passenger commuting and hid amongst the dozens of people and began writing down on a air sickness bag a note. And it can pretty much be described as a suicide note, and it read as follows. Hi, Ray. I think it's sort of ironical that we ended up like this. I asked for some leniency for my family. Do you remember? Well, I got none, and now you'll get none. So, as we know, this plane ended up going into a severe downward spiral that resulted in loss of life for everybody that was on board. There were no survivors. So, when the investigation went underway, they uncovered the flight voice recorder, and that's something that is a key component to when they're investigating plane crashes. And they also found, along with the flight voice recorder, part of the Smith revolver. And in this Smith revolver, they were able to find that it still had part of a finger attached to it. And they also were able to find the air sickness bag, which is quite astonishing considering the plane went up in a fiery ball of smoke when it hit the ground. The recording picked up the sound of Burke going into the bathroom near the cockpit soon after takeoff. It's what is assumed he was loading his weapon and going back to his seat where he left his note. The next thing you heard was gunshots ringing out. This is where they believe Ray Thompson was shot dead by David as an act of revenge for being fired. Now, the pilots recognized the sound and immediately started calling down to air traffic control for help, but only one call went out. Now, the flight attendant on board, she rushed to the captains with Burke closing in on her, and her name was Deborah Neal. She had been with the airline for 17 years and was simply just trying to head home, but she would never make it. Now, her voice is picked up on the flight voice recorder saying, "We've got a problem," before you heard the gunshot, and the pilot's asking her, "Well, what's the problem?" Then you hear Burke's voice on the recording saying, "I'm the problem," before the sound of both pilots being shot can be heard. Burke, then on the flight deck, sent the plane into a nosedive, is what they believe. You can hear the sound of the engine revving, and they believe he ended up taking his own life as well as everyone on board. But before he did that, there was one more gunshot that could be heard, and that was because when they looked at the passenger list, they found that there was an off-duty pilot on board that flight, and they believe Burke shot that pilot down to prevent the pilot from saving the plane. And that man who was shot down was Douglas Arthur, who was a chief pilot with PSA. So you can pretty much only imagine the sheer horror that the people on the plane were experiencing as it slammed into the hillside with no survivors. Bodies were not able to easily be identified due to the sheer force of impact. They said when the plane hit the ground, it created such a massive crater into the earth and showed a major problem with lapse in security at the time. Now, for this type of plane, it was considered the first and most deadly incident involving the British Aerospace BAE, and the incident happened super fast with only 6 of the 12 bullets being used when they uncovered the gun. Now, searching for bodies and any kind of clue through the wreckage would take at least 2 to 3 days of searching before they found anything that was linking the crime together. Now, out of the 44 passengers that were on board, they were only able to identify 11 of them. And at the end of it all, they found out Burke had left a voicemail on his girlfriend's answering machine telling her his eerie goodbye. Now, as a result of this accident, or incident I should say, several new laws and regulations were put into place. One was that of something that should have already been in place long before, was an immediate seizure of airport credentials upon any kind of termination, resignation, or retirement from the airline. And they also put into place that air personnel, any kind of employer or employee, were subject to searches prior to boarding the plane, such as all the regular passengers were. And finally, there was a bronze marker commemorating the victims of this flight in the Garden of Hope section of the Los Osos Valley Memorial Park. And that will do it for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for listening in on Pacific Southwest Airline Flight 1771. If you have anything you would like to add on or anything that I missed, please feel free to do so. You can email at manicmanorpodcast@gmail.com. You can reach out on Facebook or Instagram at Manic Manor Podcast, and you can also reach out on YouTube as well. So until the next episode, I hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and I will see you in the next episode.